Good morning, bonjour tout le monde, and thank you for joining us online. Merci à chacun d'entre vous de vous joindre à nous pour cet événement en ligne. I'm particularly thankful that Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft, and Laura Rosenberger, the director of the Alliance for Securing Democracy, will help me lead this co-announcement this morning. Since this is a first for many of us, let me begin very briefly with a few housekeeping matters. Throughout this event, you can submit your questions in the chat window on the right side of your screen. We'll have brief remarks by the three of us, followed by a chat amongst the panelists, and then, of course, we'll try and get to as many questions as possible. Pendant cet événement, vous pourrez soumettre vos questions dans la boîte de dialogue sur le côté droit. Les courtes remarques seront suivies par une période de discussion et à la fin, nous essaierons de répondre à vos questions. It's a pleasure for me to be here with all of you in what is effectively my first ever online announcement. I've been privileged to be a member of Canada's Parliament for 20 years, which has provided me with a unique way to see how digitalization has changed the ways our democracies operate. When I was first elected as a member of Parliament, I didn't think I would ever be representing my constituents through a virtual committee of Canada's Parliament. This past few weeks have provided many countries, including our own, with an experiment in using the internet in how we support our democracy. We've been asked to adapt, our institutions have been asked to change, and we are seeing just how great are the opportunities and the challenges that lie ahead. J'ai été élu député pour la première fois en 2000 et ces 20 dernières années m'ont permis d'observer comment nos démocraties s'adaptent à l'ère d'Internet. Représenter les résidents de mon comté via une session en ligne du Parlement m'aurait semblé inconcevable il y a quelques années seulement. Mais la pandémie de COVID-19 a propulsé nos institutions démocratiques vers l'avant. For many years, the internet was presented to us as a land of opportunity, one that ensured collective freedoms and was a natural ally to democracy. These past few years have served to some extent as a cooling mechanism, showing us how vulnerable we can be to threats to both cyber infrastructure and to campaigns of disinformation. The coronavirus pandemic has only served to heighten those phenomena, the good and the bad. So today we're here looking and talking about the good. I'm discussing with, as I said, discussing with Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft, and later his colleague Jan Nutzik, and Laura Rosenberger, the director of the Alliance for Securing Democracy, here online with viewers listening in from around the world. We are here with partners from civil society, the private sector, and government, working together to make the internet safer, more secure, and more resilient. Through platforms such as this one, democratic discourse amongst citizens, civil society, and elected representatives continues around the world. What citizens now ask of us is that we come together to ensure the internet remains an effective democratic tool, that it is resilient in the face of threats posed by malicious actors, and that it serves as a place of secure communication and reliable information sharing. Canada is now taking the lead to protect electoral processes from interference by co-leading Principle 3 of the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace. Aujourd'hui, nos citoyens s'attendent à ce que l'Internet se développe de manière à demeurer un partenaire de la démocratie, qu'il soit résilient lorsque confronté aux actions d'acteurs malveillants et qu'il continue d'offrir un espace de communication et de partage d'informations sur lequel chacun d'entre nous puisse compter. Atteindre cet objectif ne se fait pas tout seul. Elle doit être bâtie dans le système grâce au travail constant des gouvernements, de la société civile et des entreprises à travers le monde. C'est pour cette raison que j'annonce aujourd'hui que le gouvernement du Canada mènera une équipe de travail pour assurer la protection des processus électoraux. Avec nos partenaires, Microsoft et Alliance for Securing Democracy, nous allons mener le travail sur le principe 3 de l'appel de Paris pour la confiance et la sécurité dans le cyberespace. The Paris Call was born in 2018 to encourage all actors to come together to address the threats endangering citizens from cyberspace. Canada, along with 75 states, 27 local governments, 343 civil society organizations, and 632 companies, have pledged to support the 9 principles outlined in the Paris Call. Over the next few months, Canada will be working with its partners Microsoft and the Alliance for Securing Democracy to prevent electoral interference in our country and work with democracies around the world. In his address to UNESCO in 2018, French President Emmanuel Macron highlighted how civil societies, private actors, NGOs, intellectuals, journalists, and governments are all co-guarantors of our common interests. This is precisely what should drive us to work more closely together. With us today, we have 2 fantastic partners whose work has been truly outstanding. Alliance for Securing Democracy might be a relatively young organization, but has proven highly effective. Already, they have developed research and analyses that are helping protect democracies around the world. And Microsoft has been a phenomenal partner to Canada's democratic institutions, choosing to adhere to our Declaration for Electoral Integrity Online. Microsoft has also been one of the earliest global corporations to step up and commit to building a cyberspace that was reflective of our shared democratic values. It is a true privilege for Canada to have Microsoft as a partner, and I thank its president, Brad Smith, for joining us so early in the morning in Seattle. I'm happy to report that our work has already started. Tomorrow, we're moving ahead with our first workshop, which will bring together 30 organizations on the topic of improving multi-stakeholder information exchange. Notre travail est déjà entamé. Dès demain, un groupe de travail composé d'une trentaine d'organisations se réunira pour améliorer les pratiques d'échange d'informations entre partenaires. So thank you, Brad, and thank you, Laura, for the work your organizations have done so far on these critical issues. Canada and me personally, I'm looking forward very much to the work we can collectively accomplish together. So I'm now honored to introduce Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft, to say a few words. Brad?
Well, thank you, Mr. And a bonjour tout le monde ce matin. I'm really delighted to be here this morning to represent Microsoft. We believe this is an important day. It's an important day first because what it builds upon, the Paris Call, as Minister LeBlanc reflected. The Paris Call was born on the 12th of November, 2018 in Paris. That was an important day because it was the day after the centennial of the end of the war that was supposed to end all wars, the armistice that ended World War I. But of course, we recognize that it did not. Challenges continue. Prime Minister Trudeau was there in Paris for the Paris Peace Forum that really gave birth to the Paris Call. The Paris Call is important really for 2 reasons. First, it brought together on that day in 2018, 341 different signatories. And second, because everyone came together to do something important, to endorse 9 principles that are really needed to protect the internet and safeguard the future. As President Macron noted in Paris on that day, one of the great lessons from World War I, and frankly, the 20 years that followed, was the importance of defending democracy. And the other was the need for multilateral efforts to do so. Indeed, in the 21st century, multilateral efforts that bring together not only governments, but multi-stakeholder approaches that bring together civil society and companies as well. Today builds on that announcement, really, in my view, in one of the most important days since that original announcement in 2018. Because what we're talking about today is a series of communities, one community for each of the 9 principles, to make sure that these principles come to life, that they stay vibrant, that they move forward. This particular community, the community on countering election interference, is, in my view, one of the most important of the 9. In part because if you look at the 9 principles, it is this principle against election interference that is one of the most novel. And also, given the issues of the day, it is one of the most vital. As we're seeing in ongoing news developments, the problem of election interference is not going away. If anything, we're seeing more countries act with more sophistication to undermine the importance of democracy in the future. And as I always like to reflect, I may work for a company like Microsoft. We believe fervently in the future of technology, but we also believe that democracy is even more important than technology. And therefore, we have to use technology and come together to safeguard democracy's future. One of the things we need to do to make this effective is bring people together. And that's what today's announcement reflects. We are bringing together 3 co-champions for this particular community. I can't imagine a government better than the Canadian government to work with in this regard. A government that has been leading in safeguarding democracy at home, a government that is respected around the world for the democratic principles for which it stands. It's also a great honor and a privilege for all of us at Microsoft to have an opportunity to work with the Alliance for Securing Democracy of the German Marshall Fund and with Laura Rosenberger, its senior fellow and director. As the minister mentioned, an alliance that is young, but an alliance that's also proving its worth. It's not just important to bring people together, it's actually important to get things done. And as you've heard, that is what we're committed to doing with this community. There are a number of additional steps we need to take. We need to do more to share information on the relevant threats that we're all seeing, the attacks on democracy in Canada and in the 75 other democratic nations around the world. We need to do more to build resilience of political campaigns and parties against cyber threats. We need to do more to fight disinformation and misinformation, especially even amidst this pandemic with COVID-19. We need to reinforce the work of important groups like NewsGuard, which is working with bona fide journalistic outlets around the world to better provide people with access to reliable, newsworthy, and journalistic sources. We need to do more to promote end-to-end verifiability of elections, as we're doing at Microsoft with our Election Guard initiative, as well as the paper trails and the kinds of audits that can limit the risks that we all need to address together. Ultimately, I think the most important thing that we need to do with today is what we are doing with today. This is not a one-time announcement. It's not a one and done event. It's the first step in a number of steps that will follow, starting tomorrow, starting this week, as you heard, with additional expert workshops and with a clear goal in sight. This November the 12th will mark the 3rd anniversary of the Paris Call, and it gives us an opportunity to work between May and November to create a guide to the kinds of best practices that can be used, that can be applied by governments around the world. So we are delighted to be part of this. We are committed to its success, and we feel privileged to work with such great partners. Let me now turn it to the 3rd of our co-champions this morning, Laura Rosenberger. Laura?
Well, thank you so much, Brad. And it's such an honor to be here with you this morning and with Minister LeBlanc and to be working together on this really important effort. I feel like it's become a bit of a cliche to say that securing democratic institutions against foreign interference requires a whole of society approach. But it's true. This is a conclusion we've consistently reached in our research and analysis, and one heard frequently from many analysts and policymakers about this issue. But operationalizing that to make it a real approach and not an empty call is often the challenge. It requires new models of partnership and cooperation, given the ways that the challenge of interference in our democratic institutions crosses all three sectors. That's why I'm so excited to be partnering with the Government of Canada and with Microsoft on this effort, because it's a true embodiment of that whole of society approach and an example of how we can build sustained and permanent mechanisms for new modes of cooperation. This is no small task, and we have a lot of work ahead of us, as you've both indicated. Democracies around the world are facing shared challenges, and we need to be better at sharing information on both the evolving nature of the threats we're facing and the lessons that we learn about what works and what doesn't work in response. That information exchange, that sharing of best practices that both of you mentioned is so important. And we really hope that this community underneath the Paris Call umbrella will provide a mechanism for capturing and sharing those lessons in a more sustained and robust way. The Government of Canada set a great example for many of such practices in its own elections last year. And Microsoft's great work that we heard from Brad about in terms of ways to better secure our electoral processes is also essential. We often talk about disinformation or cyber attacks as discrete or tactical operations, and we often approach them in the context of elections as one off events. I think this is particularly in the United States, given some of our own experiences. But COVID is a reminder that these are ongoing activities aimed at weakening democracies and undermining our institutions. It requires ongoing vigilance and efforts to build resilience in our populations in a sustained and ongoing manner. The pandemic just exacerbates these challenges. Authoritarian regimes and malicious actors are seeking to take advantage of the crisis for their own advantage in order to undermine our institutions and weaken our democratic governments. Our own polluted information environments and the ability to manipulate social media only make us more vulnerable. And in the US and other countries, we're facing the challenge of holding an election, not just in the face of cyber threats from malicious actors, but also while trying to keep voters safe from the pandemic. As we've heard this morning, the internet and technology can provide great opportunity for democracy. And I think as we look over the past year at some of the democratic protest movements we've seen against authoritarian actors around the world, it's important to keep that in mind. And the challenge for us is to determine how best to harness that technology for the good of democracy and to prevent those who would seek to undermine it. I'm so excited to be partnering with both of you on these ongoing efforts. Thank you so much.
So, Laura, thank you, and thank you for the work you're doing and your organization is doing, both in the United States but also globally. As I said at the beginning, we're going to have a chat amongst the three of us briefly, and then obviously we'll answer questions from those joining us online. You can ask your questions in the chat box, and in about 15 or 20 minutes, we'll go to questions and look forward to answering as many as we can. But perhaps let me begin the conversation, Brad and Laura, by saying that our collective presence here today, this morning, starts with, as we've all said, our organization signing on to the Paris Call for Trust in Security in Cyberspace. And the overarching goal, as we've said, of the Paris Call is to ensure that we bring the community together to ensure peace and security in cyberspace. Perhaps, Brad, let's start with you. For Microsoft, as I said, Microsoft has been a global leader in these efforts for a long time. Why is it so important for your organization to try and pursue the elements of the Paris Call?
I think it's important in part because we see the problem firsthand. Given our services to customers around the world, not surprisingly, we have important customers that are governments, that are political candidates, political parties, think tanks, and the like. And given our own threat intelligence center, we've been not just observing, but acting upon what we've been seeing since 2016. Unfortunately, what we continue to see is not just growth in numbers of attacks, but in increasing sophistication. And what that has really led us to conclude is that we need to do more as a company, and we've been striving to do that. We have a Defending Democracy program that's led by Jan Neutze, who will be stepping in for me in a moment. But it also has really meant doing more to partner with others, and hence the significance of this effort today.
Yeah, Laura?
Well, thank you. From my perspective, one of the most important aspects of the work through the Paris Call is this mechanism it provides to bring together stakeholders from different sectors. I spent a good bit of my career in government, and sometimes the tendency when you're in government shoes is to think the government provides all the solutions, and to see all the challenges to partnering with other kinds of organizations. And the private sector faces its own challenges sometimes in partnering with governments, and civil society sometimes doesn't quite have the mechanism to get in the door with governments. And so I think one of the most important aspects of the Paris Call is creating that mechanism to facilitate exactly the kind of cooperation we need to address these challenges. These are really significant challenges that we face if you go through the principles outlined in the Paris Call. And principle 3 around foreign interference in electoral processes is a significant one in and of itself, and as Brad indicated, one of the most novel of the principles. So I'm not sort of naive to think that we can solve everything through this one mechanism, but I do think that building these kinds of collaborative fora where we can really sit down as equal partners at a table and be able to work through different kinds of approaches and solutions is a really important start.
So thanks, Laura and Brad. Perhaps, and you both referred to it in your remarks and even in this conversation so far, since the Paris Call was signed, a great deal has happened. A great deal has emerged in terms of technology changes, access to technology by a number of state and non-state actors, and some with malicious intent. Perhaps, Brad, before you have to leave our conversation, I think I would certainly benefit, and I know many people would, from your reflections on what trends you've seen since the Paris Call, and what challenges are emerging, and what collectively we can perhaps do to meet those challenges.
That's a really important question, and I would note a couple of things. First, I think that our understanding of the problem has gotten better. It has become more sophisticated. There have been efforts by national governments and universities and think tanks and groups like Laura's around the world that have really helped shine a light, and tech companies like Microsoft and many others, I should underscore, have really brought to the surface the nature of these election interference campaigns. Second, I think we're doing more. Certainly we as a company, but not just us alone, others across the tech sector, as well as in collaboration with governments, have taken a number of new steps over the last 2.5 years. Our defenses are stronger as a result. But third, as with all such challenges, what we see so frequently in life is as the defenses get better, the offensive attacks get more sophisticated as well. So we're seeing more types of attacks. We're seeing a greater range of targets. And there are some days when it even feels like there are, 1 or 2 more governments getting in on this. So unfortunately, the challenge in many ways is as great or greater than it was, even though I think we're in a better position to defend against this.
Yeah, very interesting. And the coronavirus, we can perhaps talk about that afterwards. Laura, do you have some reflections on that?
Yeah, I think Brad really summarized it well. I would just add that one of the challenges that we're seeing in a number of different countries as well is that as these tactics begin to really take root and have some impact on society, society itself can become more fractured. And I think some of the polarization that we've seen in a number of countries, the breakdown of democratic institutions in some places, a more polluted information environment, as I mentioned earlier. There's a lot of talk right now about the infodemic alongside the pandemic, where we see so much mis and disinformation about coronavirus. But that really polluted information environment actually makes it easier for malicious actors to come in and try to manipulate conversation aimed at other parts of society, other democratic institutions, elections, et cetera. So I think that the challenge has compounded in a number of different ways as well.
So, Laura, I was going to ask about the pandemic and about coronavirus, but it's a perfect bridge to that. Many democracies around the world are giving new space to online conversations, to online tools. Elections, in fact, are even starting to look a bit different themselves. I'm wondering, Brad, if you have some reflections on how the pandemic itself is impacting these different trends. What new challenges would you see for democratic institutions and for the democratic space? Building a bit on what Laura just said, using the pandemic and coronavirus as the most recent and dramatic example.
It has been really notable to see what has happened over the last 2.5 months, since so many countries around the world have had to make such fundamental changes beginning around the 1st of March. Interestingly, for a few weeks, we saw a bit of a reduction in nation-state attacks as they too had to shift people to home. But in the last 6 weeks, in April and May, we've seen a resurgence. And we're seeing a resurgence in part playing on people's fears and uncertainties around COVID-19. We're seeing a rise in misinformation and disinformation around COVID-19 and its causes and its effects. We're seeing an increase in cyber attacks against hospitals. I'm one of more than 40 individuals that joined a call this morning, really asking governments to protect hospitals just as they're obligated to do in times of war under the Fourth Geneva Convention. We're also seeing more sophisticated efforts that are looking at elections, and this is an important election year in the United States and a number of other countries. So you put all of this together, and it really just shows the severity and the significance of the threat environment we're currently facing. It's here where I apologize. I have to give my excuses and say goodbye this morning, but Jan Neutze will step in for me, and I know I'm in good hands not only with him, but with the two of you. So thank you very much to the Canadian government, to the Alliance for Securing Democracy. As I mentioned, we are fully and wholeheartedly committed to working together. I think together we'll make this a success. So thank you.
Brad, thank you.
Goodbye.
Thanks again. And we look forward to welcoming Jan to the conversation. Jan, thank you for joining us. Jan Neutze is the Senior Director for Digital Diplomacy at Microsoft, but has been leading in Microsoft, at Microsoft, a lot of these conversations and a lot of this discussion, both with civil society and governments and other partners. So Jan, thank you for joining us. Perhaps building on what Brad just said in terms of the coronavirus, Laura, do you have any reflections on what more perhaps governments and civil society and private sector actors like Microsoft could do specifically around misinformation and disinformation on the coronavirus? Because the bridge to our conversation this morning is obvious that these are, in some cases, divisive elements in democratic societies, and people seek to exploit those divisions and those fears to destabilize democratic institutions. I'm wondering if you have any reflections on what collectively we can do to secure and stabilize democratic institutions at a critical time when we're all collectively trying to work together on this global public health challenge.
Yeah, I think I'd have two specific suggestions. The first is that when we talk about disinformation or misinformation, we often talk about it through the frame of countering it. But in fact, you mentioned in your opening remarks, Minister, this really important idea of resilience. And one of the most important things that we've learned about reducing the effectiveness of disinformation and misinformation is, in fact, ensuring that there is quality information that is provided in an affirmative way to prevent information voids from developing for manipulators to try to take advantage of. One of the reasons that mis and disinformation has been so prevalent and effective in the context of coronavirus is people have significant uncertainty and they're searching for information. But when when governments, when responsible actors aren't quite sure of the answers yet to some of the questions people have, it provides a great opportunity for those malicious actors to come in and just fill the information space with conspiracy theories, with false information, with things that are aimed at manipulating people. The same is true around elections. If manipulators want to come in and say, oh, here's where your polling place has changed, here's where it actually is. The best way to deal with that is actually to have very clear information in place in advance on people's polling locations, on making sure that it's out there in a significant way. And I would say both governments have a responsibility in ensuring that we are much more affirmative in putting forward that information. Tech companies play a role in making sure that their platforms surface that kind of information. And we've seen around coronavirus a lot of tweaks that different companies have made to their algorithms to make sure that trusted sources are the ones that come up first in people's results. And civil society can play an important role in also pointing to the places where there are voids that need to be filled with quality information. So that's point one. Point two, just very briefly, is one of the greatest targets of the mis and disinformation around coronavirus is governments themselves, to say they're not actually producing results. They're not protecting people. And so it sounds like a simple and somewhat tautological response, but one of the best things that governments in particular can do in ensuring that attacks on our democratic institutions don't take root is that they are actually showing the democratic institutions work. And again, there's a place for civil society there to help people, help remind the population of why our civics matter so much, of the importance of democracy to our lives. And I think that tech companies have an important role to play there as well in terms of shoring up their institutions through their technology.
Yeah, that's very, very helpful. Jan, do you have any reflections on that?
Yes, thanks so much, Minister, and thank you both again for helping to kick this important event off today. It's an honor for me to be able to join with the two of you. So let me just say that at the top. I would say a couple of things as they relate to the nexus, really, of what we're seeing in terms of mis and disinformation related to the pandemic, and how that then potentially harkens back to the challenge of elections. One is to say that the kinds of actors that are using the disinformation playbook in this pandemic certainly is not limited to just one particular nation state or one actor alone. And there are several countries who I think have studied what has been used by some countries in the past and are now very effectively applying this playbook as we're in this pandemic environment. And I think that should give us some pause, and we need to be prepared that we may end up seeing something similar also as we get closer to some of the major elections. So the last challenge may not necessarily be exactly as the next challenge will look like. And I think we need to be vigilant. The second thing I would say is, at least from a Microsoft perspective, we have in fact seen COVID-19 themed lures, phishing lures in particular, that are trying to compromise people's accounts, targeting customers in all 200 plus countries around the world. So this is a global challenge. It's not limited to just Western countries or the global North. In particular, countries and folks and organizations in the global South, I think, are vulnerable. And so we need to figure out how we actually use initiatives such as ours to work on this concept of resilience, both for democracies, but when it comes to the pandemic, most certainly also for other countries around the world. And then the last thing I'd say briefly, and you started to touch upon it, in terms of the evolution of these threats, and let me bring it back a little bit more again toward elections. And I would say two things. One, certainly in the disinformation space, we are seeing new types of approaches that are used sometimes by nation state actors, oftentimes also by domestic actors, when we look at the creation of malicious synthetic media, otherwise known as deepfake technology. Sometimes it doesn't even get to the level of deepfake technology, and it could just be what's called a cheap fake or a shallow fake. But the essence of manipulating media to a point where a viewer or a user simply cannot trust the authenticity or provenance of what they are seeing is certainly something we're seeing already happening today. And while we have not seen that used to large extent in the context of elections, it is another trend that I think we all collectively need to be watching and be vigilant about. So those would be some initial reflections, and happy to address some of this in more detail.
So thank you, Jan. And just perhaps a last quick question, and then we can obviously go to the questions online. Ahead of the 2019 Canadian federal election, so our national election last year, my predecessor, Karina Gould, who was Minister of Democratic Institutions, then released the Declaration on Electoral Integrity Online, which tried to establish a common understanding with social media platforms about industry's responsibility and role in the democratic space. Microsoft, as we noted, was one of the first global platforms that signed on to this declaration. It certainly was important for Canada. I'm curious briefly to hear perhaps from the two of you on what role industry can play in protecting democratic institutions and democratic space, and why it's important for private sector companies to maintain the integrity of our systems online. Laura, do you want to start, and then we'll ask Jan to conclude?
Sure. Yeah. I think that, Canada did a number of really interesting things in advance of its federal elections last year, between some of the task forces that were set up to share information, some of the principles and requirements that were laid out for releasing information to the public if interference activities were detected, and then the piece that you mentioned in terms of protecting the democratic space online. And I think that that kind of approach that really brings in the private sector as partners, that understands that we need to figure out ways to enable democratic participation and ensure that we are actually giving people space to use the internet for democratic purposes and preventing it from being perverted for malicious purposes is really important. I think it's important to think about it in that affirmative way as well. Personally, I'm very concerned in some places where we've seen an instinct to think about how to close off space online as a way of dealing with mis and disinformation, essentially to censor or remove content in a way that the government sort of pushes. And to me, that's problematic, not only because it's at odds with democratic principles, but it also actually plays directly into the hands of authoritarian regimes that want to actually see a more controlled and closed off information space, and to have us weaken our own democratic institutions. And so I think that the approach that Canada used is a nice contrast to that kind of approach, to think about how to partner in this more affirmative way to protect our democratic institutions and that online space for democratic organizing.
Yeah, that I think that's very insightful. Jan, do you want to add something about the role that industry can and should play? And as I say, your company was one of the best examples early on, joined by others. But your reflections would be interesting on that too.
Sure, thank you, Minister. And let me just take one word to acknowledge and congratulate you on all the work that the Canadian government has been doing. We heard about some of it already. I just want to echo what Laura and Brad have said, and that is, you were among the first, if not the first, I think, Western democracy that, in fact, elevated the issue of protecting democratic institutions to a cabinet level position. So just from sort of a way that government is organized, we think that was an incredibly important move. And you also led a set of important work in the context of the G7 meetings that took place a couple of years ago, when I think about the Charleroi commitment to defending democracy. And so a lot of really trailblazing work there. But you're absolutely right. It can't all be done by governments alone. And we think industry in particular has a role to play in this space, working with governments and civil society. There are a couple of things that we are doing specifically. Brad mentioned we created the Defending Democracy program at Microsoft over 2 years ago, really to try and do three things. One is to use technology to help improve the resilience of the electoral process specifically. And there are things that can be done that relate to using advanced forms of encryption, for example, to apply as redundancy system to elections, which, by the way, we think should be paper-based. So to be really clear, it's important to have paper, but it's also incredibly helpful to have additional security technology to help secure the trustworthiness of elections. Two, helping to train and protect political campaigns and parties against these hack and leak operations that I think we've all become too familiar with, unfortunately. And in that context, it's really important, I think, to understand the asymmetry that we're dealing with here. Think about nation-state attackers essentially as military-grade attackers who are going against, say, a political campaign that is run by some staff, a few maybe core staff, and an army of volunteers. And in many, if not most cases, they will not have a sophisticated IT or cybersecurity operation. And so helping to balance this asymmetry is, I think, where industry can help, whether it's through trainings, whether it's through providing access to the best and most effective technology that is often only afforded by Fortune 500 enterprises. And so this is where we've come in and tried to actually develop some of these things in a more tailored, custom way to make these things affordable and provide access. And then the third is the issue of really defending against disinformation and misinformation. We've covered this already, but there too, very clearly, industry has an important role to play, whether it is to ensure that authoritative content is being filtered to the top, whether it is to help, in fact, provide quality information that relates to elections and voting, to make sure that voter suppression efforts are not effective. Those are really the three aspects: elections, campaigns, and disinformation, how we've approached this from a Microsoft perspective. And as Brad mentioned, many other companies are doing important work in this space as well.
That's very helpful, Jan. Thank you, and thank you, Laura. Those reflections certainly help advance my own thinking, and I think the people joining us online will benefit from those insights. Why don't we now turn it over to Christine, who will be our moderator for the portion of the next 15 minutes, answering questions that have been posed online. So, Christine, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Minister. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Ministre. On a reçu plusieurs questions. We've received a number of questions, so I will share them in both English and French, and then turn it over to the panel. Alors, j'ai posé les questions en français et en anglais. Notre première question vient de Elizabeth Thompson de CBC pour vous, Monsieur le Ministre. Les experts indiquent qu'ils observent des pays comme la Russie et la Chine qui prennent avantage de la pandémie pour diffuser de la désinformation. Que fait le gouvernement du Canada pour contrer ceci? So first question from Elizabeth Thompson from CBC, and that's for you, Minister. Experts say they're seeing countries like Russia and China take advantage of the pandemic to spread disinformation. What is the Canadian government doing to counter this? Over to you, Minister.
Christine, thank you. And I think that's obviously a very topical and important reflection. Both Laura, Brad, and Jan have offered some insights into what can be done collectively. Our government thinks that building up citizen resilience is one of the most important things that we can do. Our government has funded already 6 organizations across the country, citizen organizations, civil society organizations that have done some work and are doing some work in this space in terms of informing people about reliable sources of information, countering disinformation and misinformation campaigns. Governments, as has been said by my colleagues, this morning aren't able to do all of this alone. Obviously, we need partners in the technology sector, and many global companies and smaller actors have stepped up to partner and to do important work in this area. But civil society, and Laura's organization is perhaps a great example of a North American partner doing work in this space. Governments can't simply legislate their way out of this. There's no regulation that a cabinet can promulgate that will solve this. The internet necessarily should be an open and free space for public discourse, but it has to be a safe and reliable space for that free speech. So that's certainly how our governments approach this. But we look forward to doing more work, and that's why this morning's announcement is a good example of how we as a government with partners can do more work and do that globally with other democracies as well.
Great, thank you, Minister. Merci, Monsieur le Ministre. Une prochaine question de Catherine Lafrance de la Fédération professionnelle des journalistes du Québec. À vous, Monsieur le Ministre, tout d'abord, puis ensuite au panel. Ça bâtit un petit peu sur votre réponse précédente. Donc, les systèmes qui seront mis en place seront certainement efficaces, mais les fausses nouvelles et la propagande, qu'elles soient étrangères ou domestiques, peuvent saboter ces efforts. Ils érodent la démocratie, nuisent à la santé publique, on n'a qu'à penser au mouvement anti-vaccin, par exemple, et se répandent à la vitesse d'un virus. Que comptez-vous faire pour lutter contre ce phénomène de société? So this next question is from Catherine Lafrance of the Fédération professionnelle des journalistes du Québec. First to the minister, and then we'll throw it to the panel, and this builds on some of the previous conversations. For sure, these efforts will work efficiently, and thank you for sharing, but let's face it, fake news and propaganda can sabotage it all. Whether it's foreign or domestic, this phenomenon erodes democracy, not to mention what it does to public health, anti-vaxxers movement, for instance. What do you intend to do to fight it? Over to you, Minister.
So thank you. I'll take a shot at answering it in French, and my colleagues may offer some reflections in French or in English as well afterwards. Il n'y a pas de doute, comme j'ai mentionné tantôt, que notre gouvernement est conscient que la mésinformation offre une occasion franchement inquiétante quand ce qui a trait à la résilience des institutions démocratiques, mais dans le contexte d'une pandémie, aussi à la santé publique, non seulement au Canada, mais à travers le monde, avec une pandémie qui est nécessairement globale. Alors, nous croyons que en attirant des partenariats avec la société civile, des acteurs importants dans le secteur privé, comme Microsoft ce matin, c'est une occasion importante pour les gouvernements, les démocraties, mais parlons de notre gouvernement canadien. C'est une occasion importante d'informer les citoyens, de bâtir une résilience chez les citoyens canadiens en ce qui a trait à la mésinformation, d'offrir un endroit sécur et fiable en termes de renseignements pour que les gens puissent s'alimenter. Nécessairement, une pandémie offre aux gens une occasion importante de s'alimenter des renseignements et des avis fiables et ne pas tomber dans le piège de la mésinformation que beaucoup, malheureusement, non seulement de pays, mais d'autres acteurs vont essayer de répandre à travers l'Internet.
Yeah.
Laura,
go ahead, please. I'm happy to
Great. Well, unfortunately, my French is not up to standard, so I will respond to the great question in English. So I think the point is a really important one. Not only is disinformation and misinformation deeply destructive to our democratic institutions, but it's also been around forever, and it's not going to go away. And so I think the most important thing for us to focus on is how do we reduce the effectiveness of it? One of the things that we've seen over the past few years is that technology has actually enabled disinformation to have a much larger scope and scale and spread. The anonymity of the internet allows for people to take on false personas. The computational aspects of manipulation of information is an entirely new thing. And so I think that's where we really need to focus. Number one, how do we build resilience in our societies? And number two, how do we address the ways in which technology is making this type of activity much more destructive? I think, the third piece is when it comes to foreign actors, I do think that there are certain elements we need to look at, whether in terms of cost imposition or ways we might be able to deter some of this activity. Setting norms and principles through things like the Paris Call is one way of doing that. I'll confess to being pretty skeptical that we're going to be able to deter a lot of this activity just because it is, so easy to conduct, so cheap, et cetera. But I do think that it is important to respond in a robust way when we do see these kinds of activities from foreign actors who are using these as ways of attacking our country. But I think that kind of more systemic approach, not playing whack-a-mole with each piece of disinformation or each false story, but really understanding not just from the content perspective, but that behavioral aspect, that underpinning of the infrastructure allowing these tactics to take such root. That's, I think, where we will have a little bit more success.
I completely agree with those remarks. Let me just add one additional data point here, and that is something that Brad touched on earlier, but let me elaborate. And I think when we talk about the need and the importance of building a resilience among the broader population and among certainly folks who are consuming online news, for example, media literacy is such a foundational component of how all of us, I think, need to engage with technology going forward. There's things that governments can do, certainly from an educational perspective and a curriculum perspective. But when we look at groups such as NewsGuard, I just wanted to put that out there for your consideration. NewsGuard is really interesting in that they have hired a group of former journalists to evaluate online news websites in a number of different languages that essentially are looking at a set of journalistic integrity criteria. And based on those criteria, they are developing what they call a nutrition label for an online news website, as well as a red or green rating. And so their approach is not one of censorship and trying to get content removed. It's really about working with news platforms and outlets to try and adhere to these criteria. The way that these labels, nutrition labels and ratings can be consumed is through a very simple browser plugin that is available for all common browsers. And we think it's a really tremendously interesting and important approach, and that they are trying to provide this additional transparency and context about people using and consuming news from these certain websites. So it's not about rating things, as Laura said, trying to play whack-a-mole and trying to get after each and every individual article that may contain mis or disinformation. It's about rating the news source itself and really providing people that context. There are some other efforts that are similar out there, but the main message I would echo is it's up to all of us to try and boost media literacy in a much stronger way than we might have done in the past, as this problem is not one that is likely to go away anytime soon.
Excellent. Merci beaucoup, Yann. Thanks very much, Yann. I think that's a great message to conclude on. It's up to all of us. We all have a role to play. Donc, c'est tout le temps que nous avons aujourd'hui. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Ministre, Laura, Brad, Yann, pour cette discussion très importante. Et merci à tous ceux et celles qui se sont joints à nous aujourd'hui. Ceci met fin à notre événement. So on that wonderful message of all of us having our part to play and contribute, that is all the time we have today. Thank you very much, Minister LeBlanc, Laura, Brad, Yann, for this important discussion. And thank you to everyone who has joined in with us remotely today. This concludes the event.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.